Chapter 13, Macroeconomic Policy, Aggregate Demand and Supply Analysis. Part 1. This is a two-part video. This chapter is big, so I've broken it down into two parts. So in this chapter, we're going to learn the essence on how the Federal Reserve makes a decision. How are these policy makers making a decision what they should do? Should they do monetary easing? Should they do monetary tightening? Under what situation? How do they do their work? So this will give us a better insight as to what the Federal Reserve is actually trying to do. So the first thing we have to know is that the Federal Reserve has two mandates. It's called the dual mandate. The dual mandate that they have is to control inflation, which is to make sure that prices are stable, which will be denoted by pi, inflation. And they have a target called pi t, which is I have a target for inflation. And second is they have to stabilize economic activity. By that, they want to stabilize and maximize unemployment to stable levels. And that would be denoted by YP, the potential of output or economic activity. So the Federal Reserve has this two-part mandate. So remember this. Not every country's central bank has a dual mandate like this. There could be, let's say, the European Union. They have a hierarchical mandate where the primary objective is price and inflation, and everything else follows. Meaning you can't do anything if the prices are unstable. Like you can't think about unemployment on top of like price inflation. So if you can only do one thing, the mandatory hierarchical view says just think about price. But in the United States, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. So they have to balance inflation and output with unemployment. So once we have that context as to why Federal Reserve does certain things, you need to know what is the reason behind it. And it comes down to these two competing things. And we will see why they are competing things, but it's like unemployment and price stability is their dual mandate, right? So now we understand this, there are multiple scenarios that can happen. There could be supply shocks and there could be demand shocks. So we will look at the demand shocks here in these two graphs, and we will look at the supply shocks, temporary supply shocks here, permanent supply shocks here, right? So that's the set of shocks that the economy goes through. A shock is basically, let's say, our oil prices goes up because if the United States imports a lot of oil, then that is a shock because now all of a sudden the manufacturers have to put more money than what they're used to putting for building those products. So a shock can come in terms of, like, let's say the financial crisis, like 2007, 2009, where the demand greatly reduced because of financial crunch in terms of lending stopping because of the mortgage collapse, right? So there could be many shocks that the economy goes through, and the Federal Reserve has to make sure that they are able to handle these shocks. And so we will look through some of these scenarios here. But demand shocks and supply shocks, aggregate demand shocks, which is here, short term and long term, they behave the same way. But the supply shocks, in temporary shocks, behave this way, but permanent shocks behave this way, which is very different. So that's the dimension. When an economy goes through a shock, either through a demand constraint or a supply constraint, then the supply has two variations depending on temporary or permanent, whereas the demand follows the same. So that's another key distinction to remember. And there are two ways of looking at it. On the left, you will see there is a no policy, which basically says, hey, the Federal Reserve doesn't do anything. There's a shock, deal with it, right? But on the right, there are options where they actually take an activist stance, saying, hey, I'm going to stabilize inflation. I'm going to stabilize output, right? So these are the options that they have when they actively engage into stabilizing the shocks. So a policy can be an activist policy where they're like, the chairman of the Federal Reserve believes that, hey, the price changes, the wage hikes, they are very slow to correct. So I need to do something, right? So there's an active government policy, which are on the right-hand side graphs. But then there's also like a passive or a non-activist, which is exactly the opposite, meaning the prices and wage correction is fast, there's no need for an active government policy to handle unemployment and inflation. So if we understand these three dimensions, then we can understand like what's really going on behind in the minds of the Federal Reserve's chairman. First, they have this dual mandate. Second, there are different types of shocks that they need to understand, like, hey, is it a supply shock, is it a demand shock, is it a temporary shock, it's a permanent shock, and they need to understand, hey, what's my stand? What should I do? Should I be active or should I be a little bit passive? And then this comes from the fact that they have a target, and they have come up with these targets to say, hey, I have YP, which is my potential. I think the United States can produce this much. So if it's less or above, then they know what their stand is going to be. Same, they have an inflation target. And this inflation, this target for inflation, target for output can be summarized really well by this Taylor rule, right? Which says, what should be the interest rate, the federal fund rate R that the Federal Reserve should set? Because remember, they have two objectives. So the formula is R equals 2 plus half of pi minus pi t plus half of y minus yp, which basically says, hey, I have this 2% historical average, and I'm going to do a weighted average of the inflation gap and a weighted average of the output gap. So that is, if you plug the numbers in, like, hey, if my target is the Federal Reserve, which they tell us in the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee, hey, my inflation target is this, or my output target is this. Once you know that, you know the current inflation, you know the current output, you can actually get to the fund rate, the federal fund rate, right? So remember, inflation drives the what they know, the Federal Reserve knows about the potential inflation or potential output drives the interest rate. Right? So that's a leading indicator in some sense. So federal fund rate is a weighted average of 2% historical average plus weighted average of inflation gap, output gap. So that's the Taylor rule. And that, I believe, is what Alan Greenspan, Bernanke used to guide their federal fund rate. So now we know this, right? How the rates are changing. And we also in the previous chapter learned about the MP curve. We learned that interest rate R and inflation is an upward sloping curve, right? So if we have lower inflation, then there's lower interest, right? So it's an upward sloping curve. This is the MP curve, the monetary policy curve. We've seen this in the last chapter, but I'm quickly revising. So tightening, monetary tightening, and monetary easing. So monetary tightening, this is the MP curve. What does MP curve monetary tightening mean? It would mean that the MP curve shifts up, right? So you see this MP curve is going up from here to here, meaning for a given inflation target, it's actually increasing the interest rate, right? It went up from R1 to R2. So this is what happens when the MP curve shifts up for a given inflation target. I equals R plus pi. We know this, right? As to how I is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve sets. R is the real interest rate and pi is inflation. So when MP curve shifts up, meaning when they shift the MP curve up, interest rate I goes up. When I goes up, R goes up and pi goes up, right? Through this equation. So when I goes up, R goes up and pi goes up, right? And when pi goes up, pi is basically inflation. When basically interest rate goes up, the real interest rate goes up, its inflation goes up. When inflation goes up, the demand goes down. Primarily because things are more expensive, so people will buy less of it. So when demand goes down, output also goes down. There will be less demand for it, so the output will be, factories will produce less. So monetary tightening means interest rate goes up, output goes down, before that demand goes down. So remember this is a refresher from the previous chapter. Similarly, monetary easing is when the MP curve shifts down. When the Federal Reserve says, hey, I'm going to monetary ease the monetary system. And so it shifts the MP curve down. And so for the same inflation, the interest rate drops from R1 to R2. So when interest rate drops, demand goes up because it's cheaper to borrow. So I'm going to go borrow and I'm going to use it and spend it, right? So then the output would go up because there's more demand for it. So the key refresher here is that monetary tightening leads to decrease in output when the Federal Reserve thinks that, hey, the country is overheating. They'll do this. They'll tighten the economy and reduce the output. When they think it's like the potential is higher for the country and it's actually producing less, then they will do monetary easing and quickly get the output back up. So this is monetary action of tightening and easing. There's also a fiscal way of doing it, but fiscal policy is much, much slower. It takes time, there are lots of lags, which we'll see in the next video, as to how monetary policy can quickly change the demand, aggregate demand and aggregate output. So now, see, to quickly refresh, dual mandates, there are two types of shocks. What the dual mandate is currently doing is to reduce the output gap, reduce the inflation gap, and there are two ways: monetary tightening and monetary easing, right? So once we know this, let's look at some examples as to what the Federal Reserve needs to do and how they do it. They either do monetary tightening or monetary easing. So now let's look at aggregate demand shock, which is this. And this is both aggregate demand shock temporary and aggregate demand shock permanent. So now when we say there's an aggregate demand shock, what does that mean? An aggregate demand shock means AD1 moves to AD2. So there is a demand shift down, right? So the AD curve shifts down. The demand went down. So when there's an aggregate demand shock, like the 2007-2009 financial crisis, there was an aggregate demand that was dropped. When aggregate demand drops, the AD curve shifts down. And so what happens is this point, which was AD1 and AS1 intersection, is now point 1 moves to point 2, right? So this inflation, which was pi 1, now it's pi 2, it's reduced. And so remember, given at this point, at point 2, you will see that the economy y1 or y2 will be producing less than yp. When it's producing less than yp, what will happen is slack will get built, right? Because there is more that it can produce. And so what happens is then the AS curve shifts down as well, so that it can again intersect at this line YP, because it has to go back to its potential. So when there is no policy done and there is an aggregate demand shock, meaning there is no monetary policy of tightening or easing, this is what happens. What happens? Inflation drops, output temporarily drops and then goes back. So this is what happens when there is no policy action, no monetary policy action. We just saw how inflation drops from 1 to 2 to 3, and output becomes slightly unstable, but it comes back to YP. Similarly, this is when there is non-activist policy. But what if there's a Federal Reserve say, hey, I don't like this. I want the output to be stable, much more stable, and I don't want my inflation to go down because this inflation pi 1 is my target and I want it to be that. So then what they can do? They can do monetary easing. When they see a demand shock, right? When AD1 has moved from AD1 to AD2, this one here, they can do monetary easing. And when they do monetary easing, we just saw they will reduce the interest rate. AD will go back up, right? So when AD goes back up, what happens is 1 moves to 2, and then 2 moves back to 1, which is 3 here. 1 is equal to 3. So what they did, in a sense, is that they have stabilized inflation. The real interest rate still drops in both cases, actually. Aggregate demand went back up and YP remains stable. So what we saw in this is that if it was a non-activist government, Federal Reserve, then the inflation does drop and there's instability in output temporarily, there's pain. But here, inflation stays the same. Output also is stabilized. In both cases, the real interest rate R drops because of this MP curve that we saw, right? So that was aggregate demand shock for both temporary and permanent. It's the same. It behaves the same. If it's a non-activist Federal Reserve, it'll behave this way with a drop in inflation. If it's temporary, so temporary movements move back up again. Meaning, if it was temporary shock and if 82 goes back to 81, then the same thing will happen. Meaning 3 will go to 2 and 2 will go to 1 and AS1 will go to AS2 if it's temporary. But if it's permanent, then there will be a permanent drop in inflation, which is the key learning here. And that might be bad because let's say the Federal Reserve say, hey, pi 1 is our target. Why is it dropping to pi 3? That could lead to a negative spiral. So now we just look through aggregate demand shock, temporary and permanent. The only difference being temporary, what curve it follows the same back in non-activist. Similarly, if the monetary policy was easing, they'll actually tighten when they see the demand going back up. So that's the permanent and temporary difference. But it's very different when it comes to supply shocks. So temporary supply shocks behave very differently. So supply shock basically means that AS1 moves to AS2, assuming this is a temporary supply shock that is negative, right? And this is all negative supply shocks. You can draw something very similar for positive supply shocks. So if it was a negative supply shock, then the AS curve shifts up to the left, right? And so for the inflation moves up from 1 to 2, right? Aggregate demand supply analysis, if aggregate supply goes up, inflation goes up, right? And so what we also see is that the output temporarily decreases. Output decreases. Inflation temporarily increases. So similarly, given it's temporary, 1 will go to 2, y1, yp will go to y2, and then it will go back up, right? So if there is no policy action, inflation will temporarily increase, output will temporarily decrease, and then once AS2 goes back to AS1, it will readjust. But if the Federal Reserve is like, hey, this is not okay, because there's pain, right? There's less output, inflation's going up, they're like, hey, no, I want to stabilize inflation. So now they have a choice they have to make. They can either stabilize inflation, in which they'll do this, or they'll stabilize output, where they'll do this. So that's the key difference. In temporary supply shocks for an activist Federal Reserve, they have to either choose improving inflation target and keeping it same, or improving and keeping the output same. So if they decide, hey, inflation is more important at this point, because of how they have a dual mandate, remember? At any given point, they have to think through both. So if they decide, hey, for our country, inflation at this point is more important to stabilize, what they see is that, hey, 1 has gone to 2 because AS1 went to AS2. And then what they do is they will stabilize inflation by monetary tightening. Monetary tightening, remember, they'll increase the interest rate, aggregate demand will go down. So then what happens here? Aggregate demand goes down. You see this? So 1 will go to 2 and 2 will go to 3. And so what happened in net, inflation remained the same. It was what it was here, it's the same here. It temporarily went up, but then the active Federal Reserve quickly tightened, so they increased the interest rate, and so the inflation went down. And so what we see in this, right, temporarily, this is again temporary, 1 to 2 to 3 is temporary, is what we see is that inflation was still stable, but output temporarily went down. It went down from target YT to Y3, right? So stabilizing inflation at this point led to a reduction in output. Likewise, but again, remember, this is temporary. So 3 will go back to 2 and 2 will go back to 1 again. And at that time, they will have monetary easing because they'll go opposite of what they just did. But now let's say they were like, hey, unemployment's very important at this point. For whatever reason, it was really bad. So unemployment's very important. And so output, economic activity is important. Why is important? So what they do? Now we have a permanent supply shock. So temporary supply shock. So AS1 went to AS2. So then what happened here? What they would do is they would stabilize the output by monetary easing. So what they do? Monetary easing. reduce interest rate, increase aggregate demand. So the demand goes up, right? So from here to here, because on this aggregate demand curve, AS1 shifted to AS2, so the inflation went up, you see, from 1 to 2. But then the output also would reduce if there was no action. So, but then because of monetary easing, inflation further continues to go up because now we have an aggregate demand curve which is shifted up because of monetary easing. But we see that the output remains the same. But inflation went up crazy, big time. So that was the choice that the Federal Reserve has. Like, hey, if I focus on inflation, my output will go down. If I focus on my output, my inflation will go up. And so when it is temporary, they have this choice. They can go in one direction and then they'll go in the opposite direction to quickly make sure there's stability provided in one of those two major buckets that they're trying to optimize with this Taylor rule, right? Similarly, permanent supply shock. This is a big one, right? Permanent supply shock, there is this other aspect which is long run aggregate supply curves, right, which is a straight line. So in permanent supply shock, what happens is AS1 goes to AS2 and the AD stands there as is. So the inflation went up, but also long run aggregate supply went from LRAS1, which is this line, to LRAS2. And so when that happens, your potential output permanently changes, meaning Y1P is now Y2P. So it is stable output, but it is much lower when there is no policy action. When the government doesn't do anything, there's a long run permanent supply shock, like the oil price permanently went up and it stays up, right? Then this is what happens. Output goes down if there's no policy action, and it does stabilize at the new potential, Y2P, and the target also, and the inflation also goes up and stays there permanently, right? So that's a new target. So YT1 becomes YT2 at this point. So the long run aggregate supply permanently goes down. But let's say they decide, hey, we want to be active in this situation. We don't want to be no policy action when there's this permanent supply shock. They can do two things. If they do monetary tightening, so AS1 went to AS2, so 1 went to 2, right? And when they do monetary tightening, aggregate demand falls down, which we saw. So the inflation is under control, right? Inflation is stable, but output permanently dropped. They did monetary tightening. Monetary tightening leads to reduction in output, which we saw reduction in output. Similarly, they could ease into this as well, but the output will be stable, but inflation will go up, right? So long run aggregate output will be stable here. So YP remains as is. Here in this case, Y1P becomes Y2P. There's a shift, but in this case we see pi1 becomes pi2 becomes pi3. So it's the same conundrum in both of these situations. If you see this one and this one, this one and this one, right? But the key difference is that there is this thing called so if you see here, right, there is this overall reduction in output here. It does stabilize inflation. So stabilizing inflation does stabilize economic output, right? But here there's a permanent damage. There's a permanent damage on the output. That's the key learning. Meaning the output permanently reduced when there's a long run permanent supply shock. So it's quite important to have a monetary easing policy right here. Otherwise, and at the expense of inflation, if inflation is manageable, otherwise what will happen is your long run output will permanently reduce, which will be quite important. Let's say you're China, because if you can't produce output, then that could have a huge impact, cascading impact on your output overall. Great, so that was useful, right? We went through the dual mandates. What is the Federal Reserve trying to do? What are the things that they do? There's a supply shock. There's there's a demand shock, which is here. There are two types of supply shocks: temporary, permanent. What do they do if they are no policy? If they tighten, if they ease, and there's different outcomes. And based on where they are in terms of optimizing for their dual mandate, and we know this Tyler rule, they will actually either do tightening or easing.